something quiet and technical happened on this Sunday night in the summer of 1971 that would reshape the global economy forever. It didn't play out on a battlefield. It didn't happen in a single dramatic summit. It happened in a televised address. President Richard Nixon announced a set of economic measures which temporarily suspended, among other things, the dollar's convertibility into gold. Such a technical-sounding decision would turn the dollar from a promise backed by metal into a currency backed by faith, by government, policy, and the willingness of the world to accept it. To understand why that mattered, we need a quick reminder of how the post-war monetary world worked. For decades after World War II, most currencies were effectively pegged to the US dollar, and the dollar itself was pegged to gold. That was the Bretton Woods system. Built to stabilize trade and encourage reconstruction, it gave the United States an outsized monetary role. But by the late 1960s and early 1970s, the arrangement was creaking. The U.S. was running trade deficits, financing a costly war abroad, and seeing inflation pick up at home. Foreign holders of dollars began asking to convert them into gold, and U.S. gold reserves were strained. A system that once guaranteed confidence was beginning to creak under the weight of political and market pressure. Nixon's August announcement, what has been called the Nixon Shock, was blunt in its effect, even if it was couched in economic jargon. By closing the so-called gold window, the United States effectively told foreign central banks they could no longer swap dollars for gold at the fixed price set under Bretton Woods. The move was presented as temporary, wrapped into a broader package that included wage and price controls and an import surcharge. But the temporary suspension was the fulcrum. Once governments and markets accepted that dollars were no longer automatically redeemable for gold, the foundation of the fixed exchange regime shifted. The post-war monetary order unraveled over the next 2 years, and by 1973, most major currencies were floating. Why would such a bold step have been taken by the policymakers? The reasons were practical and urgent. The U.S. was exporting dollars around the globe to pay for imports, military commitments, and overseas spending. Foreign holders of dollars increasingly questioned whether the United States could honor a promise to convert those dollars into gold on demand. At home, inflation was eating into purchasing power. The Nixon administration believed it needed to stop a run on gold, stabilize exchange rates, and give domestic policymakers breathing room. The solution: stop the gold drain, regain control of domestic policy, and rebuild negotiating leverage for an inevitable new monetary order. The immediate consequences were chaotic and creative. Exchange rates that had been fixed now began to float. The euro-dollar and offshore markets expanded as dollars moved freely across borders without the previous constraints. Financial markets experimented with new instruments. Central banks adjusted their thinking, and the IMF and other institutions scrambled to reimagine an international monetary framework. In a short historical arc, the world moved from a metal-backed promise to a system where trust, policy credibility, and the deep liquidity of American financial markets supported the dollar's central role. That is how a currency becomes, in practical terms, paper, not worthless paper, but money whose value depends on institutions and confidence, rather than a weight of metal in a vault. Floating rates introduced new volatility. Currency competition reshaped trade, and a global system dependent upon American liquidity and credit deepened the United States' economic preeminence. In time, new patterns took shape: the recycling of oil revenues through Western financial markets, the development of offshore capital centers, and the interlacing of finance with geopolitics. The Nixon Shock helped speed an evolution toward a world where monetary power, credit lines, and banking relationships would be central levers of statecraft. It also rewired the incentives. If money isn't anchored to gold anymore, then who determines its value? The answers are complex: central banks, fiscal policy, market expectations, and the architecture of global finance. The U.S. dollar retained an extraordinary role due to the size and depth of U.S. financial markets, from America's political influence to a network of trade and investment that favored dollar liquidity. Such a position allowed Washington to run deficits and deploy economic pressure in ways it could hardly do under a strict goal constraint. But it has also meant America shares more of its economic fate with global markets. Missteps in policy can ripple faster and wider than before. For ordinary people, the effects were subtle at first, then unmistakable. Over the 1970s, prices rose faster, currencies fluctuated, and travel and trade felt different. For policymakers, the tools changed. Exchange rates could be targets or shock absorbers, while interest rates and fiscal decisions took on new weight.
For financiers and corporations, a new playground opened, one of derivatives, currency markets, and global flows that could be marshaled for profits or strategic influence. The Nixon Shock didn't just change how governments managed money, it changed how money moved, how power flowed. Looking back half a century on, historians and economists debate the balance of costs and benefits. Some argue that leaving gold behind was inevitable, that growing economies and complex financial needs simply outgrew a century-old metal standard.
Others point to the 1970s as a decade of painful adjustments, stagflation, market turbulence, geopolitical strain, whose roots lie partly in the policy freedoms and constraints that replaced gold. What's clear is that a single Sunday night in 1971 touched off a reordering of incentives whose echoes we still live with: floating rates, fiat currencies, leveraged finance, and a global monetary hierarchy with the dollar at its center. International Monetary Fund. If there's a takeaway for our era, it is this: money isn't just a tool for trade, it's a political instrument. The Nixon Shock reminds us that the rules that govern money are choices, and those choices shape which governments can borrow freely, which industries thrive, and which countries command influence in the global arena. When currency is paper rather than metal, confidence in institutions become the real reserves of power. Understanding that helps explain not only the economic history of the past half-century, but also the geopolitical currents that still run through balance sheets today. The long-run implications were even more profound. Unshackled from the constraints of gold, monetary authorities gained room to use policy for domestic ends, to fight unemployment, to tame inflation, to manage growth. But that flexibility came with trade-offs.